Earlier this week on Monday, we talked about what life is and really came up with a solid definition for it. Today, we're going to be looking at theories that try to propose an explanation for the origin of life. The first thing we need to do is look at the evidence that we have. The first thing is that there's not much rock left from 3.5 billion years ago. It's all gone under and back into the mantle of the Earth. So finding fossils in that obviously is going to be impossible. If not impossible, extremely difficult. What we do know, according to the fossil record, is that extremophiles existed around 3.5 billion years ago, which is the same time roughly that the fossil record kind of blacks out. However, these early life forms were much too complex to be the first ones, and no theories currently explain their existence in the fossil record. Another little piece of evidence that we have is the distinguishing features between archaea and bacteria. First is that we see a clear progression in cell formation and organization, which are important. This progression that we see, this really indicates the antiquity of the archaea and a kind of progression along the line of unicellular organisms. And then roughly 2.7 million years ago, we start to see eukaryotic cells, which are even more advanced. So again, we see this kind of line of progression suggesting that it can continue back, just like it has continued forward. I'm sure most people are familiar with, or at least heard of, the primordial soup theory. This is the orthodox theory in science for how life has originated, but there are big problems with it. It suggests that the composition of the early atmosphere and oceans were conducive to the formation of long peptide chains, which are chains of proteins forming amino acids. It is thought that eventually at one point a self-replicating system kind of emerged, although very small and very elementary, and then Darwinian evolution would take over and start to form new things. And the fact that we don't find these, the explanation is that there is no fossil record that you can find them in because it's all gone. However, there are 4 reasons why this has completely failed in explaining the origin of life. First is that the experiment incorrectly predicted the composition of the atmosphere and the oceans at the time. Second is that the main product of these reactions was gunk, not living organisms or amino acids. Both L and R forms of amino acids would have been made in this aqueous solution, but we only see the L form being used in organisms. Lastly, number 4, the formation of peptide bonds would not be favored in this aqueous solution. A very interesting theory that I saw that I just want to mention briefly is clay and iron pyrite replicators, or crystal replicators. And this is the idea, I guess you can call it life from dirt. It's the idea that clay and crystal, since they can self-replicate each other, were the basis, were like the foundation of life coming into them. Then they would replicate, and that way you could start Darwinian evolution due to the replication, and then you can get favoring of certain traits and stuff like that, and eventually come out with more organisms we're familiar with, like bacteria. The only problem with this theory, and it's a big problem, is that there's no experimental evidence at all, and it's 100% conjecture at this point. Lastly, I want to talk about extraterrestrial life. Now, there are 2 theories that surround this. One is that comets and asteroids kind of brought life to Earth in the form of whether it be amino acids or archaea, bacteria. But there are problems. One is that there's no evidence of this happening. 2, proteins are still not considered life. 3, how would they survive the impact? And 4, if you really think about it, it kind of postpones the question of how they form in the first place. The next extraterrestrial life theory is that beings transplanted humans onto Earth. It's the idea that life was intelligently designed by these beings. You could even go as far as stretched out that life was intelligently designed by some creator, like a god, for example. Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA, was a big proponent of this theory. He saw that DNA was so complex that there's no way to explain its existence other than attributing to some creator. And for him, he thought it was extraterrestrials. There's one big problem with this, and obviously you can ask that next question: where did those extraterrestrials come from? This isn't really answering the origin of life question in general. It's answering the question of the origin of DNA, the origin of life on Earth, rather than origin of life in general. So today we concluded that really the orthodox theory doesn't fully stand up to scrutiny. And one of the biggest things and one of the biggest hurdles in this whole conversation surrounding the origin of life is that we can't go back far enough to gather the information that we need in order to make these conclusions. This leads to a ton of different possibilities, such as I had mentioned before, like a creator god transplanting humans here, or some kind of extraterrestrial life, or all these different things that we will be getting into in the future. So if you're interested in that kind of content, make sure to subscribe.